if the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation. Should that time ever come, we do not intend to be lectured on intervention by those whose character was stamped for all time on the bloody streets of Budapest. It is clear that the forces of communism are not to be underestimated in Cuba or anywhere else in the world. The advantages of a police state, its use of mass terror and arrest to prevent the spread of free dissent, cannot be overlooked by those who expect the fall of every fanatic tyrant. If the self-discipline of the free cannot match the iron discipline of the mailed fist in economic, political, scientific, and all the other kinds of struggle as well as the military, then the peril to freedom will continue to rise. Secondly, it is clear that this nation, in concert with all the free nations of this hemisphere, must take an ever closer and more realistic look at the menace of external communist intervention and domination in Cuba. The American people are not complacent about Iron Curtain tanks and planes less than 90 miles from their shore. But a nation of Cuba's size is less a threat to our survival than it is a base for subverting the survival of other free nations throughout the hemisphere. It is not primarily our interest or our security, but theirs, which is now today in the greater peril. It is for their sake, as well as our own, that we must show our will.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the best. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 023, Dr. John Newman on JFK, Oswald, and Cuba. Our guest tonight is author Dr. John Newman. This is actually part 2 of our discussion with Dr. Newman, as in episode 017 we discussed JFK in Vietnam. So you can go to our free archives and download that one today. Dr. Newman was excellent as well as enlightening, and I'm sure you'll want to hear that one. So he'll join us next in the Midnight Hour to continue our discussion on JFK, Oswald, and Cuba. Tonight we have a quick cleaning of the castle. Our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. Our Twitter page is at MWN_ST Patrick. Our email is midnightridernews@gmail.com. And our LinkedIn account is under the name ST Patrick. That's S.T. Patrick. So we'll be right back with Dr. John Newman. How much did Richard Nixon know about the Watergate break-in? Was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post really heroic in its uncovering of the Watergate affair? What roles were really played by Alexander Haig and John Dean? And what's this about a call girl ring linked to it all? If you want to hear the story of how Richard Nixon was brought down by a silent coup, listen to episode 003 of the Midnight Rider News Show and allow Lynn Kalani to tell you how Watergate really happened.
This is Len Kolodny. You're listening to Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Police patrol excited crowds in Havana who found that while they slept, behind the scenes strongman General Batista had overthrown the constitutional regime of President Carlos Prio. Once before in 1933, when only an army sergeant, Batista staged a revolt. Now as then, his co-conspirators in the army, navy, and police seized key points. The present coup was accomplished in only 77 minutes, but Cuba's political freedom is ended as Batista cancels the June 1st elections. Batista says he is a friend of the people as his soldiers patrol the streets to establish what he calls disciplined democracy.
In front of the presidential palace in Havana, nearly 1 million people, which is just about the whole population of this capital city, gathered at the bidding of their new leader, Fidel Castro. The summary courts-martial and executions of Batista followers have brought criticisms from abroad, especially America. Castro wanted to know how his countrymen felt on the subject, and the hysterical reception shows that Cubans would support just about anything he did. Dr. Castro, a 32-year-old lawyer, has recently banned the Roman holiday-type trials at the local sports stadium. He certainly displays great eloquence and a powerful personality.
Con que la revolución cubana sabe también pelear y ganar batallas en este campo.
It looks as if the chances of the ex-president's followers are not worth a cupful of burnt sugar. Despite outside criticism of Castro's methods, trials and executions will continue.
This is part 2 of our discussion with Dr. John Newman. Now let's turn to 1959 and the rise of Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and Che Guevara. Dr. Newman, what role did the CIA play in the Revolution of '59, which is the fall of Fulgencio Batista and the rise of Castro?
You wouldn't imagine it. Castro was Times Man of the Year in '58, and the CIA was backing him. They were giving him money and arms to help overthrow Batista. And they began realizing at the very end, when they were at the end of '58, that they were having difficulty convincing Batista to leave, that something was wrong with Castro. He was using American companies as a supply depot, and collecting taxes from U.S. sugar companies and cattle companies, and kidnapping some Navy guys, things like that, that didn't that really caused people in the agency that thought he was going to turn out to be a bad guy to scratch their heads. And so at the last minute, the whole thing turned into trying to stop Castro from getting control of the apparatus. So they tried to put together a junta that Castro could be part of, but it didn't work. So what happens is the CIA helps create Fidel Castro, and once he's in, they decide the next best thing to do is to try and stop him from taking the island communist. And he plays the game. He comes to Washington in April and pretends like, oh, no, I'm not a communist, and I'm not going to do that. Well, by the end of the year, by the fall, actually, it's very plain, and everybody knows it, so they decide the only thing to do about the problem is to kill him. But the United States wanted Batista gone. They wanted Trujillo gone. And the reason for that is because in the propaganda war we were having with the Soviet Union, it looked terrible for us, and it really didn't. We lost all kinds of points with the rest of the countries that belong to the Organization of American States, especially on account of Trujillo, but Batista too. And so it was the policy of the Eisenhower administration to try and replace Batista, not by assassination, but and Trujillo, to clean up our act. But downstream, what happens is President Eisenhower, look, and I'll tell you that Volume 2, which is where we're going now, Countdown to Darkness, changed my whole view of Eisenhower. He was the guy who made the military industrial complex speech. I thought he was on the golf course, chilling it in the last few months of his life. And no, he was the guy behind the curtain, in The Wizard of Oz. He was banging on the heads of Allen Dulles and others to get the job done to kill Castro. And so what he also needed was the death of Lumumba in the Congo and the death of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Why? Because he couldn't move alone against Castro and knock him off in his regime without support from our NATO allies and from our friends in Central and South America. And the price for the NATO guys, especially France and Belgium, at the time Belgium chaired the NATO, was chairman of NATO, was to dispatch Lumumba. And I actually have the document from the Church Committee that shows that Eisenhower was careless enough to actually order Lumumba's murder in a National Security Council meeting. It was deleted. The guy who deleted it later confessed to the Church Committee exactly what was said. So it's a triple play. It's not just the assassination of Castro. I think that our view of these three leaders and the ZR rifle program, of which their deaths were a part of, have been looked at as disconnected, and it shouldn't be. And I didn't know until I wrote this book the importance of that. It really is interesting that the price for NATO was Lumumba, and the price for the Organization of American States was Trujillo, and that's the way it worked. And so it really was Eisenhower himself, the president, who was pushing all of this, and having his National Security Advisor, Gordon Gray, pounding on Dulles to get it done quicker. So I've drifted into what the agency's overall Cuban policy was, and it's really Eisenhower's policy. It wasn't something they recommended to him. It's something he told them that he wanted them to do. As far as the agency's component of it was, mostly it has to do with overthrowing Castro, of course. That's the key. That's the center of the whole thing. That became the program in 1960 called the Covert Action Program to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba. It had lots of components: a propaganda component, a political component with the exile leaders, a military component that was not to include U.S. Forces, although Eisenhower probably would have been more willing to do it, or Nixon certainly would have, if Kennedy had not been elected. So it changes under Kennedy. The CIA program changes drastically as a result of the election of President Kennedy. But under Eisenhower, after Batista was agreed to leave, and he left in a hurry because the Castro's forces were closing in on Havana, then we see Castro goes south. The policy changes to kill and overthrow him, and then the Republicans lose the election. And a lot of that was over Cuba. Kennedy pounded and pounded and pounded on the Cuban thing that they failed in Cuba and on the missile gap.
Now, regarding the JFK assassination, I've been asked quite often, why would the CIA and the mob sort of team up and do anything in conjunction with one another? But it's not a far leap when we look at the Batista years that the CIA and the mob were sort of conjoined, at least in Cuba. Is that not correct?
Yeah, sure. There was a lot of mob connections there.
Okay, so let's turn a little bit to the Lee Harvey Oswald story now.
Okay, I will. But I'm gonna just finish the train of thought here. There's a real reason why it was very stupid of the CIA to bring Sam Giancana into this. Okay, and I'll tell you what it is. In an effort to get control over John Kennedy, Giancana, who already had control of Joe Kennedy and saved his life a couple of times, Joe Kennedy promised that if JFK were elected, he'd be your man. And to double down on it, Giancana fed Kennedy Judy Campbell Exner, who was his own mistress. And so, and then there was Giancana playing a role in some of the primaries, especially West Virginia, by just buying people right, left, and center to throw that primary. And that was the most important one that put JFK, broken field running to the nomination. And the same thing during the election itself. Giancana's from Chicago, and they stole all the ballot boxes in Ward 1 there in Chicago and threw that state, definitely, from Nixon to Kennedy. So here comes the CIA, and they're having trouble with all these, really weird things, LSD in the air vents where Castro gives his speeches, and exploding conch shells, and skin diving suits with horrible stuff and makes your skin fall off, and pills and cold cream and all that business. And so, why don't you just shoot him? This is the question. So we figured we'll get the mob to do that. Only thing is, the mob doesn't want to do it that way because nobody's going to want to shoot Castro and, of course, not be able to escape. So they want to poison it. But Giancana is the guy. To understand that, here's the biggest thing in Giancana's life is getting Kennedy into the White House. Okay? And so here comes the CIA asking him to kill Castro. Well, if he kills Castro before the election, guess who wins? Nixon. He's protecting his own. He's being asked to do something that directly undermines his equities. To get a guy, a president of the United States, to be his guy. So it's this incestuous triangle of CIA and Kennedy and Giancana that you have to wonder, which corner of the triangle knows what's going on the other two sides. And so Giancana's in the driver's seat, and the CIA was really crazy because he wasn't going. Sure, maybe after the election was over, but not until then. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that part in. Well, there had been, contacts with the agency. Like Engelman, especially, he didn't get a lot of contacts with the mob. But for this particular job, no, really stupid.
Oh, right, absolutely. And also in 1959, a young man named Lee Harvey Oswald defects to the USSR. Now, there's been much argument on the defection.
Right.
Why did he do it? What did it mean? Who was really behind it? Why did his return seem so simple? What was the purpose of Oswald's defection? And what do we know now? So, Dr. Newman, I want to ask you, what is the truth behind Oswald's defection?
Well, I wrote about this to some significant degree in Oswald and the CIA back in 1995. I understood that there was something wrong with the records of Oswald's defection that arrived at CIA once they arrived there, and did draw attention to some of those things that were very strange, and that there was no 201 file, but there were other files open on him, and that he was put on right away, he was put on what we call the HT Lingual program. This is the mail intercept program. They're reading his mail. So I mentioned that this could have been part of a mole hunt, but I left it on the table as I thought that the chance for that was certainly less than 50-50. That it wasn't certain and not even probable. But it was a maybe, as an explanation for a lot of things, including a couple of things I want to say now about what actually happens when Oswald is over there in Moscow. But I'm now in a different place with this issue. I do believe that this was a false defection, that Oswald was witty. And I'll just put the jewel in the tiara up front here. Pete Bagley, Lieutenant Pete Bagley, who was probably our top guy in the Soviet Russia division. He was in line to become the division chief and was on the fast track to become the director of the CIA. That's how smart he was and how much people thought of him. Anyway, he was heavily involved with these Soviet defectors. Anyway, at a certain point, in a long relationship with a good friend of mine who was a great researcher named Malcolm Blunt, when Pete Bagley was shown by Malcolm the exact distribution of these incoming documents to the CIA from the State Department and from the Department of Naval Intelligence, I believe, he just, something clicked in him. And he said in no unequivocal terms, Oswald was a witty defector. That's the first time we've ever had a statement from a very senior, and in this case, person, actually not just senior, but in the know, make a statement like that. And I was very thankful for Malcolm to let me use it. And so That's the way the story ends. The first chapter ends. Countdown to Darkness, Volume 2. But I'm going to try and describe the story. This is complex. This spy versus spy stuff, you know, the book Wilderness of Mirrors is a great title for spy versus spy stuff. It's layers upon layers of deception, and even within an organization like the CIA, it's all very secret. They don't want anybody to know what they're doing with this mole hunt. So it starts really with who Oswald was in the first place before the mole hunt begins. He happened to be working in Atsugi, Japan for the Marines. He was a radar specialist, radar operator in a small radar tracking site. It's a Marine one, but it was OPCON to the CIA. It was a redundant backup for the CIA's own radar tracking of the CIA's secret U-2 surveillance aircraft. Atsugi was one of 3 places, Insular Turkey and Great Britain were the other 2. The one in the Far East was important because they could overfly the impact areas for Soviet missile testing. They'd be launched from the Urals and impact out there in Kamchatka. So that was one of the things that we were interested in. We were monitoring their ICBM program, and we couldn't find very much evidence of it being successful or even continuing. But anyway, that's who Oswald. He was the guy with a grease pencil in his hand, you know, doing the tracks on the U-2s. Now, we had a mole since about 53 or 54 or so, I don't know the exact date, a very good one from the GRU, that's the military intelligence side of Soviet intelligence, named Piotr Popov. And he tipped off his CIA case officer, George Kiesewetter, in Vienna in 1957, that there was a mole in the CIA, either in the Soviet Russian division or associated with it, that had betrayed the technical details of the CIA's U-2 program. So what the CIA did, this is Angleton, James Angleton, with the help of Bannerman, the chief of the Office of Security, was they needed some bait, some U-2 bait, to interest the KGB in contacting their mole to find out more about the bait. And the bait, after a search for a while for candidates, ended up being Oswald. And just about the right time, about 6 months or 7 months or 8 months after Popov's tip, Oswald goes Russian. He's starting to study Russian and that kind of stuff. So that seems about right anyway. And shortly after that, he requests a compassionate discharge from the military to help his mom in New Orleans, which is approved. He goes to see Mom for 3 days and makes a beeline for Moscow. And you and probably many of your readers know he somehow knows the right route to go through Helsinki, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I want to get to what happens in Moscow just a little bit and what happens afterwards. He comes in and walks into, on Halloween Day 1959, to the American Embassy, and in front of Richard Snyder, who's the consul there, and his deputy, John McVicker, throws a hissy fit, says that he wants to renounce his citizenship, although he never does, even though he could have eventually, threatens to give up his radar secrets to the Soviets. And it is a very intense argument between him and Richard Snyder, and it's apparent to me and to a lot of people who look closely, this is a performance. It's very well scripted. He stays on script. He was well rehearsed. Somebody puts him on to speaking also to a journalist, and that's going to be McVicker, not Snyder. Snyder found out about it afterwards, was very angry with John McVicker for grabbing a hold of Johnson. I think the first name. Anyway, she was a newspaper reporter for North American News Agency, and she had just come in from the summit at Camp David doing that story. She was back in town and was checking her mail in the entrance section, right where McVicker and Snyder were, and McVicker comes out and tells her that there's this American, tells her the hotel he's in, and she should interview him and remember her duty as an American, whatever that's supposed to mean. Anyway, she does locate and talk to Oswald that very night. She wants the scoop, she wants the story. Now, the interesting thing about the story she writes, she gets everything in there, the whole story, but there's one thing missing. Apparently she doesn't know about, she was not told about, his threat to give up radar sequences. So that puts the defection into a whole different light. He's just a crazy guy. He's going to commit an act of espionage that concerns what obviously could only be the U2 program. Now, I don't know that she didn't know that, and I don't know that John McVicker didn't tell her that. John McVicker comes up on my radar screen as doing some very suspicious things, which I talk about in the book, which I'm not going to get into here anyway. That's what happens. It generates a lot of cable traffic, as you can imagine. It lights up the Christmas tree at the FBI, the first document that rolls in. Everybody, all the guys at the top of the FBI sign on the back of it. And so you have a number of cables and documents and dispatches in this Johnson story that come to CIA. These are non-CIA documents coming to the CIA. So if you can kind of in your mind look at like a chart, at the top of it it says Records Integration Division RID, and at the bottom you've got a mole somewhere in SRD somewhere. But under the Records Integration Division, that's what that stands for. They are the ones that send records to where they're supposed to go. Now, the ordinary route of somebody who just defected to the Soviet Union would be the Soviet-Russia Division. Only that's been cut off, so that you can have like a dotted line going down to the Soviet-Russia Division with an X across it. Nothing's going to be allowed to go into the SRD at all. And so where it goes is not normally where it would go unless there was some strange reason it goes over to the Office of Security, all of it, which is sharing in this situation, this Oswald situation, with counterintelligence angles. So what are they doing here? Well, what they want to do with the bait, what Oswald is the bait for, is they want the KGB to ask their mole who Oswald is for more information. Now, when you don't allow the documents to go over into SRD or anywhere associated with it, the mole can't figure out anything. The mole needs to ask. And the moment you ask, you have to use a form that gives your name and your phone number. So it's like a trade for a steer or cow. They're setting a trade up to trap the mole. They want the KGB to contact the mole. They want the mole to ask who's Oswald. The moment that happens, they got the mole. And that's why all the records were shunted off into a place they ordinarily wouldn't have gone to. It's part of the mole hunt. And it happened immediately. In other words, not one document slipped through. So they knew before those documents arrived that they weren't going to let them go to SRD. They had to let the Records Integration Division know beforehand so that they didn't go anywhere else. It's very powerful evidence of how they structure internally this mole hunt to try and trap the mole. So they wait for a long time. This is November of 1959. They wait till May 1960, and they send exactly one document to the Soviet-Russia Division, which sends it downstream into the SR6 Soviet-Russia Realities branch. They do biographies on people, and so they can amass encyclopedic amounts of information on certain places, so that if they're going to place somebody in there, they know how to act, what to say, and what to anticipate. And so they send Priscilla Johnson's Nana news article, that one document. And of course, it doesn't have the hot stuff in it. It's got everything but the fact that he was going to help the KGB with the U2 program. Very interesting. And that's it. It stays that way till the end of the year. And then what happens is the State Department asks counterintelligence at CIA for information on several defectors, including Lee Harvey Oswald, which in this way makes you wonder if somebody at the State Department didn't know. And one of the reasons that it's possible is because the way CIA handles it. So they put together this response that goes over to in through the front door, pretty high up in the State Department, but I don't know who all the people who are involved on that site getting the request to be made. But in any event, it's the mole hunting unit that actually writes up the reply. And of course, one of the entries is on Oswald, only there's something wrong with the entry. The name is Lee Henry Oswald. And it's not just there, it's also in the index card that creates the 201 file, and it's in a couple other places. It's not a mistake on one document. Everything that Ann Edgerton, who worked in CISIG, the mole hunting unit under Angleton, at that particular moment is about Lee Henry Oswald. Now, Peter Dale Scott's been on to this type of thing for years, and I believe that he's right. That's what we call a marked card. And it's not just his idea. That's intelligence jargon for tradecraft. It's like the burying meal. And you send the marked card and see where it goes, and it tells you a whole lot about who's who and what people's motivations are. And that is when Oswald's 201 file was opened, by the way. That has almost nothing. It's just these 5 documents that have come in earlier and nothing else. Everything else is still being hidden. So that is, I guess, what I have to say about the defection. I've gone from just probable but not likely to the very likely viewpoint on this defection as having been a false defection as part of the mole hunt, and to use Lee Harvey Oswald as U-2 flypaper to motivate the KGB to contact their mole, so the mole will expose himself or herself. And it never worked.
And that was also why Oswald appeared to have immigrated back into the U.S. so easily?
Yes. Yeah. There came a point to pull him out. And there's a very interesting situation about the decision to come home and when he makes it, and letters that he wrote to the embassy about it, and the KGB stole one of them, and it caused a lot of misinformation and mistakes that were made about the reason for the opening of the 201 file that are now can be exposed. The KGB, first of all, just to step back here, both the United States and the Soviet Union ended up, if not very early after the assassination, but pretty soon, for the first time in their wars with each other, having a common cause. And it was motivated by the fact that after the assassination of JFK, Oswald was radioactive. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with him and to have had anything to do with him in the past. No matter how untrue that was, that had to go away. That was true for the Soviet Union. They had a guy that had defected in place named Yuri Nosenko. And so this time they sent him over just shortly after the Kennedy assassination with a brand new story. I knew Lee Harvey Oswald. I read all his files. I was with the people that, were watching him. We never touched him. We never interviewed him. We didn't care about him. We thought he was a nutcase. Well, we now know that was a mistake for him to say all that stuff because they weren't anticipating the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening up of the KGB archives, which was done for a while to news people. And in some cases, like Pete Bagley got together with Kondrashov, their best guy, and started putting 2 and 2 together. So we know that he was debriefed, covertly debriefed in Moscow. He was covertly debriefed more than once in Minsk, where he was sent to. His apartment was bugged in Minsk, and all the people that he associated with became informants the whole time. So they were acutely interested in him. And I can't tell you how many, if I added up all the branches and units inside of the CIA that were watching Oswald and did the same thing for the FBI and Navy, you would have, it's like an encyclopedia. We had so many different people with him trained in their crosshairs. And so all of a sudden, after the Kennedy assassination, we go along with Nosenko eventually and Helms hated it. And people like Bagley are all, that's the end of their careers because they were telling the truth about Nosenko. He's not a bona fide defector. But it was a modus vivendi in order to wipe the stain of the problem of interest and use of Oswald. Both the KGB and the CIA had their fingerprints all over him. And so neither of them contradicted each other's story.
The Bay of Pigs, April 17th through the 19th of 1961. This was 3 months after the inauguration of President John Kennedy. Now, we discussed the argument over air support with Jefferson Morley, who you may know. Mm-hmm. And another aspect that seems to be a real point of debate amongst historians is the one regarding the supposed internal uprising of anti-Castro forces that was supposed to take place upon the landing at the Bay of Pigs. So I would like to know the truth behind all of this. What was Kennedy told, and by whom?
Well, the internal uprising that was supposed to occur when the exile force landed was something that had been discussed and hoped for pretty much when Eisenhower approved the plan back in March of 1960. Along the way, the viability of that prediction had been looked at many times. And by the time that Kennedy wins the election, actually just shortly before it, WH-4, the branch in Western Hemisphere Division that was responsible for the Cuban operation, Jake Esterline's unit, came to the conclusion, as did the special group, the President's advisor Gordon Gray, the head of the CIA on Dulles, deputies at the State Department and Defense Department, that it wasn't going to happen. That our earlier hopes that there would be an uprising were wrong. It was never going to happen. And so very soon, a few days later, there's a problem, which they have to brief the new president-elect on the operation. And so they got to figure out, what they're going to say about that. And so what they decided to do is to write a proposal that talks about the operation and then put on a separate piece of paper the fact that they've decided there won't be an uprising, and give that to Bissell and Dulles and let them decide whether they want to include, that slip of paper that says there isn't going to be one. Anyway, that's the way it starts. It ends up, the next step that Dulles and Bissell have to go down to Florida, to the compound down there, and brief Kennedy. Dulles very astutely has Bissell do it. Well, Bissell, he's the ops guy who's in charge. So by the poolside, and he's friends with Kennedy. He goes over and lies to Kennedy. He tells Kennedy, oh yeah, it's going to happen. And every single time, all the way up to the invasion, that is the only thing Kennedy is told, that there will be a successful uprising. They knew it was a lie just before he got elected, and once he was in office, they decided they had to use it. Now, the Joint Chiefs, the air cover thing ends up being the air cover thing at the end, but and the Joint Chiefs are actually going to curiously play a role in this air cover business. But the larger story about the Joint Chiefs is this. So they're watching Kennedy very closely from the day he goes into the White House, and the very first meeting they get to sit in on. And they're going to watch everything he says. And so he asked them point blank to their faces, what do you think about the CIA covert plan to overthrow Castro? And Leonard just says it ain't going to work. They don't have enough people and stuff to make it happen. And that's the truth. He told the truth. And so the conversation continues, but Kennedy changes the subject. They want to know what he thinks about it, and he won't say. And they correctly read that. In other words, he is too quiet, and they know what that means. And that's the last time he'll ever hear them say it won't work. So within a short period of time, the first evaluation that they gave was that it would work. And then after that meeting with Kennedy, they'd done that before they saw him. After his meeting with Kennedy, they changed their minds and said it would work. Even though in the fine print, there's all sorts of stuff that, how in the fine print, but your interest rate's going to go up, to 40%. So the fine print contained enough stuff that they could get out of it and say, well, we warned you. But if you just read the cover memorandums and stuff like that, it says that, it has a good chance of success. Not just one part, but the whole thing. They're buying into it now because they're afraid that he's going to completely for neutral and Laos and abort Cuba. And so the air cover thing becomes important, and it actually would take me 20 minutes to go through the details, so I won't do that. Rust plays a big role in whittling down was a huge air operation because it's too noisy, and he knows that it's what he's saying. If he was a military guy, he would, because he was a soldier in World War II. He knew exactly how important air cover is for any amphibious assault. Normandy and all those Pacific Islands are cases in point. And so did all the Joint Chiefs know it. So Kennedy plays a role, but not to the end, when they basically have only had one air sortie, which didn't get all the planes, and the decision is whether to go back, and Kennedy says no, and they plead with him. But here's the other thing that Bissell found out, that the Joint Chiefs were actually privately dissing the whole air cover thing, saying that they didn't need it. Didn't need that much anyway. And they were making comments in the hallways and meetings, and this got back to Bissell by an officer who was upset, who was sitting in with Curtis LeMay when that kind of comment was made. So the Joint Chiefs were actually hoping that the operation would fail. They wanted it to fail. It was their purpose, their intent, that people were to die on that beachhead in order to put Kennedy up against the wall. He had told them in no uncertain terms he wasn't going to go in with conventional forces, and they didn't believe him. And so their plan was to make sure there was a lot of people getting slaughtered on the beachhead, and then they would send in the Marines and the Air Force to take care of business and get rid of Castro too. And that would be the end, by the way, of covert military operations ever being done by the CIA. They didn't have the tools or know how to do it. The big guys, they were just little Boy Scouts, but the big guys in the Pentagon wanted control over covert military operations. That's how they were going to get it. Bissell kept pressing forward, even though he knew it was falling to pieces. Esterline, his chief, and his deputy, the guy who was pretty much the architect and a lot of the stuff, tried to resign because they said it's never going to work. This is stupid. This is crazy. Bissell pleads with them to hang on, and they say yes as long as you promise to do something about the air support. But anyway, here's why is Bissell doing this? Two reasons. Number one, he thinks that Castro's going to get assassinated and the whole thing might work. Number two, if it does work, he's going to be the head of the CIA. He knows that Kennedy wants him to be in that job and he's going to get rid of Dulles. So it has to work. And if it does work, it's a gamble, but he'll get to be the head chief. Now, here's the last problem. Why is Allen Dulles going along with this? Well, because he knows. He's found out that Kennedy's going to get rid of him. And so you know where he is when the Bay of Pigs goes down? In Puerto Rico on a vacation with his wife. He's nowhere around. He lets the dagger, the sword of Damocles, fall into the hands of Bissell. So he knows that Bissell isn't going to go anywhere. Bissell will be fired. He thinks he'll lose control of his operations, but he won't lose his job as DCI. That is a horrible picture I just painted for you. It is seditious. It's terrible. I knew a lot about the Bay of Pigs, but it wasn't until I really sat down and read every document, sat through every meeting, that I began to understand what was going on. Everybody has their agenda. It's all very selfish and personal. And JFK gets stuck with the rap for the whole thing. And it undermines, of course, the Russians think he's weak, and it's just angers so many people. It's where the motive begins for Kennedy hatred that festers, into the next year and beyond. So I have a lot more. I am stopped now because I'll take another 10 or 15 minutes if I give you more details about it. But it's pretty bad.
Oh, no, I think it's absolutely vital to explain the growth of the hatred here that the Joint Chiefs and the CIA had for Kennedy at this time. Now, showing how those seeds of hatred were sown, per se, at the Bay of Pigs is a pretty important point to make, and I'm glad that you did so in such detail, so thank you for doing that. But now, let's move on to the next character in our story. Now, you've written quite extensively about a June Cobb. She's very interesting, and she's important in all of this. So who is June Cobb, and why is she important?
I have about 4 chapters on her in Volume 1, another one in Volume 2. I should say that June Cobb's CIA story is probably one of the most closely guarded secrets. There were at least 3 or 4, maybe more volumes of material in a 201 file. We did get some, juicy sexual stuff in the new release, about 56 pages, but not what I'm looking for. I'll tell you what I'm looking for. Now, very quickly, I'll just go over what I had in Volume 1 about her. Chapters 8, 9, and 10. I mentioned that George Gaffney, the Atlanta Federal Bureau of Narcotics District Supervisor, developed a case against Thomas and Rafael Harano Rosaga for cocaine and heroin trafficking. Gaffney told author Douglas Valentine that the case to take out the Colombian Brothers Medellin lab began in late 57 or early 58 in New Orleans, when a woman, quote, when a woman with CIA connections offered information to Agent Arthur Dahl. Gaffney then began working with CIA officer Robert Service to further develop the case. Gaffney successfully destroyed the lab in February 1957. The woman with CIA connections who walked into his office was June Cobb. And I have no problem proving that in Volume 1. As Gaffney developed his case against the Haran brothers, he corresponded with Cobb, who was able to supply, and by the way, she gave me copies of that, and they were all stolen, along with some taped interviews I had with her, too, from my West Virginia place when I had it many years ago. That was broken into. I didn't live there every day. Who was able to, so they corresponded, actually, and she was able to give him the crucial details for the FBN to arrest the brothers and destroy the lab. Both Cobb and the FBN told Jack Anderson that Cobb had squealed on the brothers. We also know from Cobb's, because she was in love with him, they were engaged, she felt spurned. We also know from her 1962 testimony to the Senate Committee to Investigate Administration of the Internal Security Act, I just call it the Senate Security Subcommittee, Internal Security Subcommittee, that by 1957 she was already working as an informant for the Bureau of Narcotics. The nature of her CIA connections 3 years before her successful encounter with Fidel Castro in New York remains a mystery. As I indicated in Volume 1, when Cobb's long association with the Haran brothers and her counter-narcotics work surfaced during her June 1960 interview with Ralph True, the CIA, she was less than candid about this subject. Many of the details were removed from the transcript of the interview and replaced with this statement. The rest of the story can be found in the Bureau of Narcotics report. That report is still classified. In Volume 2, tackled the question of when did Cobb first go to work for Castro. I dealt with that circumspectly in Volume 1, but here I put it under my electron microscope, or even better than that, a particle accelerator. I went into the subatomic particles of this story. At the end of May 1960, Harry Kurt Hermsdorf, a special assistant to CIA's Western Hemisphere Division Chief J.C. King, and the case officer for the recruitment of June Cobb, pitched her in Havana. According to Hermsdorf's memo afterwards, Cobb said she returned with Castro to Cuba after his 1959 tour, April 59 tour of the United States. However, in her June 1960 interview with Ralph True, he was with the Office of Security Interrogation Research Division, Cobb said that from the time of her encounter with Fidel until the middle of the summer, she was helping the 26 July movement organize charity events in New York. It wasn't even until August of 1960, to this more Byzantine version of events, that Cecilia Sanchez sent an aide of Fidel's to New York to ask Cobb to come to Cuba and work on propaganda for Fidel. Cecilia Sanchez was a senior, not a secretary, but an advisor and sort of managed all kinds of stuff for Fidel. Cobb told her interviewer, that's Ralph True, she went down to Cuba for a weekend in August. Then she talked with Sanchez about Fidel's invitation and agreed to come back in September. Well, in a lengthy 1995 letter to me criticizing Hermsdorf, Cobb delivered a similar story. The only reason I have that letter is because I misfiled it, by the way, so the thieves didn't get it. That's really great. She took Hermsdorf's entire memo and cut it into little pieces, and then when got these big pieces of paper from a Staples or something, and then she Xeroxed the little pieces of Hermsdorf's memo in the center, and then she took a big pen or pencil and wrote all this nasty stuff all around the side of every single page, calling him all kinds of names. In this letter to me criticizing Hermsdorf, she says, of course, I spent the rest of April, May, and June circulating the booklets I had published. It's about a speech, History Will Resolve Me, that Castro made when he was in jail for a coup attempt against Batista. And helping promote the 26 July banquet. In August, his emissary appeared. My phone was not working with Celia's invitation on behalf of Fidel. But I'd say Hermsdorf's account is more straightforward. Quote, after Castro's victory, he met Ms. Cobb on his triumphant tour to the States, was impressed with her, thanked her for his loyal service to the movement, and offered her a job in Cuba. Quote, she went to Havana with him on his return and was employed as an aide handling public relations. These two contradictory accounts of when Cobb first went to work for Castro are present in other locations in the document, but they all go back to one person, June Cobb. A closer look at Cobb's story in the recorded interview with security officer Ralph True is confused and incongruous. She alleged that during the months of May through August, she'd stayed in New York doing some things for the 26 July movement. She also said that during this period she needed money, although she did some work with her dearest male friend, Dr. Snapper, who was writing a medical textbook. Her explanation about the money was contradictory. So he was giving me money, not on a salary basis, but he was giving me enough money. I was helping him because I loved him and I wanted him to, and he couldn't give me money because he didn't have any, you know. And so that was last summer. The confusion in her story undermines its credibility. And even if we give her the benefit of the doubt and accept that she did spend some time with Snapper that summer, her association with him during that time appears as insubstantial as circulating booklets and doing some things for the 26 July movement for 4 months. Those sorts of activities could easily have occurred during her trips to the U.S. from Cuba that we know about from the case officer I will mention shortly. But in her frenetic 1995 article to me, Cobb belittled Hermsdorf's account of just about every episode in her life. On the question of when she went to work for Castro, she made this rant. Utter confusion, Harry. And the Statler, his last night in New York, Fidel had just said to Celia, they should bring me to Cuba. And I had answered, that's not necessary. I know the way. The explanation in this pushback is odd. Knowing the way to Cuba was hardly a good reason to turn down Castro's offer to take her back to Cuba with him. She had no money, had no real job, and as she told the CIA, Castro was as remarkable as Thomas Jefferson and Martin Luther, and his Cuban Revolution was, quote, a very beautiful thing. The account Cobb gave to Ralph True and to me is peculiar. Handing out booklets and hanging around the 70-year-old Dr. Snapper when Castro offered her a front row seat where the real action was taking place in Havana is an unlikely scenario. There's no compelling reason why Cobb could not have done propaganda work for Castro in Havana and in New York during the summer of '59. But there are more concrete reasons to question Cobb's story in the CIA interview about where she was that summer. When discussing Cobb's work for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Volume 1 of the series, I examined her March 1962 sworn testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security. Here is the relevant portion of her testimony for the issue at hand that I'm discussing now. In the spring of 1959, I went to Havana on the invitation of Prime Minister Fidel Castro. and his private secretary, Celia Sanchez, where I was in charge of English publications in the Prime Minister's office on behalf of the revolutionary government. This invitation was the result of voluntary activities in New York City in early 1959, where I published a petition Fidel Castro's defense plea after the Mercado attack and certain other activities. Cobb's sworn testimony to the subcommittee is uncomplicated, without interruption, and it makes a lot more sense. Why wait more than 4 months to get started with Fidel in Cuba? So what's going on here? In addition to Cobb's sworn testimony of the Senate subcommittee, there's another significant piece of documentary evidence about where she was spending most of her time in the summer of '59. It comes from the initial CIA Security Office check on Cobb during the period of her quote-unquote recruitment in the spring of '60. Joe Piccolo, a case officer working for the Cuban Task Force, Western Hemisphere 4, was investigating Cobb's duties as a personal secretary to Fidel Castro. On 4 April, 3 weeks after Eisenhower approved the CIA's covert action program to overthrow Castro, the CIA Office of Security Support Division, requested that the FBI conduct an expedited check on June Cobb and report back the results telephonically the next day. On 5 April, the FBI responded with 2 documents that the CIA was assigned to a case officer named Joe Piccolo. Piccolo generated a handwritten memo based upon those 2 FBI documents. I carefully scrutinized Piccolo's examination of those documents. After reading them, Piccolo wrote a handwritten memo that puts a whole new light on Cobb's whereabouts during the summer and fall of 1959. In addition, Piccolo, I carefully scrutinized his examination of those FBI documents. After reading them, Piccolo wrote a handwritten memo that puts a whole new light on everything. In addition to her name, the date, and the numbers of the 2 FBI documents, Piccolo jotted down the following 4 items. Born circa 1927. Okay, no big deal there. Personal secretary to Fidel Castro. No big deal here. But the next 2 points are activities in the United States while on vacation circa June '59. Well, if you're on vacation in the United States in June, you're not living there. You're living somewhere else. And medical treatment in New York City in September and December 1959. December '59, yes, but September, if she's back in New York for medical treatment, she's back from somewhere else. The 3rd and 4th items stand out. They unmistakably mentioned that Cobb was engaged in activities while vacationing in the U.S. Standing alone, this crucial note proves that Cobb's primary location was outside of the United States and not in New York. The 4th item is just as significant. It establishes 2 more trips to New York from somewhere else. Piccolo's memorandum substantiates that Cobb's presence in Cuba began in the spring of 1959. In very important ways, his notes corroborate Cobb's testimony to the Senate subcommittee, her statements to Harry Hermdorf, and a later interview with the Associated Press, which I'm now going to go to, that she had indeed followed Castro directly to Cuba in '59. So for this, the AP article, the source is also Cobb. Not surprisingly, 2 days before she left Cuba for the last time, on 19 September 1960, the Associated Press ran a story about her arrival in New York City from Havana. Strangely, unlike any of her other previous trips from Havana to New York, this time a group of AP reporters was on hand to interview her, probably at the airport. Their presence itself is odd and suggests that an arrangement had been made to tip them off to be on deck for a story. It appears to me that the story released by the AP might have been part of an intelligence operation. It was a short story of a half-dozen small paragraphs about her past history and her translation work for Castro. In one newspaper, this was the headline: Oklahoma woman, employee of Castro, arrives from Cuba. With that or other similar titles, there is a 100% certainty that intelligence officers in many Cuban missions at the UN and around the world would have clipped and filed that story. This is the operative part of the AP release. Quote, the former Oklahoma woman has been working in Havana for the Castro regime since the Batista government was overthrown. Obviously, Cobb's press statement that she had been working for in Havana regime since the Batista government it cannot be reconciled with the classified CIA record indicating she had not begun working in Cuba until September 1959. But here's the point. The intended audience for this news story was not American readers. They would not care one way or the other about when her work for Castro began. This story was meant to be read by Cuban intelligence. They would have looked very closely at any information about an American woman who was working in Castro's inner circle, and they know exactly when her work began. The AP news story, standing alone, reveals the following. In front of the newsman, Cobb had no alternative but to tell the truth. If she had told them anything else, if she had told them what she had told about true, alarm bells would have been set off in Havana. She would not have been safe the moment she ever set foot in Cuba again. Moreover, the people she had associated with in Cuba her friends and sources would all have been, at a minimum, called for questioning and closely watched afterwards. Any story other than what Cuban intelligence knew to be true could have endangered other ongoing sensitive CIA operations inside Cuba and foreclosed further possibilities for covert operations on the island. The most important of these operations was already in the planning stage as Cobb delivered her 19 September press conference. That operation was the CIA mafia plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, an operation planned to be carried out by June Cobb's boss in Havana, Juan Orta Cordova. The suppression of true information inside of the CIA about Cobb's Cuban activities tells us that those activities were very sensitive. A high-level CIA penetration of Castro's inner circle with June Cobb as the flypaper would meet that standard. I followed her use as the flypaper to trap the Medellin narcotics trafficking of the Ram brothers in Volume 1. Castro was a bigger and far more sensitive catch, and Cuban intelligence was growing increasingly suspicious about her and what she was up to in the summer and fall of 1959. By the end of the year, Cobb was running into trouble. Her direct access to Castro had long since dried up, and her access to documents and information was being further restricted by Orta. I now believe it is possible that June Cobb's role in Cuba had to come to an end with the security of the agency's counterintelligence operations there. To do that in a way that she did the least harm would require both time and careful planning. Internally, her 1959 role as the penetration of Castro's inner circle would have to be hidden by a pretext recruitment by the CIA in the spring and summer of 1960, backstopping the idea that she had nothing to do with the CIA before that time. Joe Piccolo's investigation of the true story was shut down in the context of the unfolding CIA JMARC program, the presidentially approved covert operation program to overthrow Castro. As the impending break between Cuba and the U.S. approached, the continued use of Cobb as an asset in Cuba, now officially so at the secret level, was becoming more dangerous for her and potentially for other CIA assets inside of Cuba. And that's my take on June Cobb for the time being. I'm not done with it yet, John.
And the continuation of the June Cobb story as it relates to the conflict within the administration is just one of the many reasons, Dr. Newman, that I'm anticipating the next volume, by the way. So back to Lee Oswald. Now, in 1963, Oswald makes two much-discussed trips, one to New Orleans and one to Mexico City. So let's begin with New Orleans. We know that he was born in New Orleans, but what was his purpose there in the summer of 63? What was he doing?
Going Cuban. He's establishing his Cuban legend. By the way, I think that I have a number of major working hypotheses that I set forth in Volume 1, and then I expanded upon them in Volume 2, and I'll do the same thing in Volume 3. Those couple of the first, hypothesis 3 and 4, both address your questions of New Orleans and Mexico City. Let me say this. I'm going to give you the first one first, and I'll get to New Orleans. The first hypothesis that I came up, by the time I got involved in Volume 2, even in Volume 1, I foreshadow, actually, in Volume 1, I had a chapter on the recruitment of Rolando Cabela and Lash in Amsterdam, in Scandinavia in 1962, right before the missile crisis. And I felt strongly, for a lot of reasons, that at some point in 62, regardless of how much earlier someone might have wanted President Kennedy to be assassinated, the contours of the plot that eventually emerged began to fall into place. An American Marxist, Lee Harvey Oswald, would assassinate JFK and appeared to have done so for Fidel Castro with assistance of the KGB. That's where I think the idea of how to do it, this false story of Oswald working for Castro in the Kremlin, sometime in 62. But when the actual operational plot itself begins, I think that your questions that you're asking about New Orleans are important, because it's when he goes Cuban that when I think that things really are moving into final form. And it doesn't start in New Orleans; it actually starts in Dallas, but not right away, because that's where he goes to first. And it's such a silly story. The guy who's been running him fame retires early for some reason we never know about, and James Hosty takes over, and Hosty decides not to go interview him. And his reason was because they were having marital problems, and he didn't want to knock on the door until they'd made up or something like that. So he never goes over and knocks on the door. And by the time he does, Oswald's gone. He's gone to New Orleans. But before he leaves, he's walking around Dallas, like maybe in January. And remember, he takes those pictures, right? And he's got this placard hanging around his neck, Viva Fidel. So it's around the first month of 63, it could be a little earlier than that Oswald's Cuban legend begins. Anyway, he skips town pretty fast, and most of it takes place in New Orleans during the summer of 1963. He builds on that legend that he started in Dallas. He's making a fake chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He does a bait and switch with the CIA's Ames Spellgroup, that's the Cuban Student Directorate in New Orleans. Right? He offers them Marine Corps publication on military operations and shooting and stuff like that, and then shows up, 10 yards from their front door, handing out FPCC flyers. And then there's a scuffle in the street. That leads to a courtroom scene, which is actually televised. The DRE guys plead not guilty, and Oswald says, "I'm guilty." He goes to jail, where he has to be interviewed by the FBI. And all this stuff, FBI Director Hoover puts into a letterhead memorandum and sends it to the CIA. Well, at the CIA, what happened to this stuff? It was not placed where it should have been in Oswald's 201 file. The reason for that was because the person who made that happen was CIA Counterintelligence Chief James Angleton, who's one of the principal architects of the next step in the operation, Oswald's trip to Mexico City. That's all I have to tell you about New Orleans. Otherwise, each one of those... Oh, I didn't mention the radio debate with Stuckey. Yeah, he did that too. So this is a guy who does everything as noisy as possible. As he can possibly. Oh, and he's handing flyers to Navy guys coming off the ships, on the dockside too. I mean, what else can he do? He works so hard every day. It's all he does is do things like this, which you would think are crazy, but they're not. If somebody's asked you to build this legend because you're going to use it in Mexico City. And that's how New Orleans and all the things that he does there actually are part of a much larger plot. This isn't just something that they made up, out of the blue. This is something that's now in motion.
The visit to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City. Now, first, why did he go? And second, we now seem to have evidence that Oswald was impersonated on the telephone while in Mexico, and there doesn't seem to be much debate regarding that telephone impersonation. However, there's a wide range of debate still regarding whether or not Oswald was impersonated in person. Now, I know Eusebio Askew and Sylvia Duran reported meeting with someone in Mexico City who they said did not look like Oswald. So, Dr. Newman, I'd like to know if you believe he was also impersonated in person while he was either at the Cuban consulate or the Soviet embassy.
Okay, so I agree that it's definitely an impersonation on the phone. As to whether or not he traveled to Mexico City, I say he went, or an imposter. I lean towards the real Oswald went down there, but I'm not dogmatic about it because there's conflicting accounts. So I'm just a researcher that has very conservative methodology, and so when there's conflicting accounts, I can't say I'm certain at all. I don't come down on one side or the other, and it really isn't important.
Well, what I would ask you...
It's what has to happen. It's what has to happen.
Is it possible that he went to Mexico City?
Yeah, sure. I lean towards that. I think,
and that he had an impersonator.
Yeah, but there's an easy way to explain why that is. It's because he failed to do what he was sent to do, and when he failed to do it, then something had to happen on the phone to make sure that it accomplished the same ends. He needed to get a visa to go to Cuba, ostensibly to go to the Soviet Union, but when that doesn't work, he's not been connected to Cuba and the KGB. All he's talking to is Sylvia Duran and a visa consul who's actually very radioactive. His name's Kostikov. But there's no record of it. There's no record. And so, having failed to do what he was supposed to do, he showed all this stuff, the FBC cards and media stuff, all the hard work that had been done to establish his bona fides as a pro-Castro guy. And it fails. And so that's when the funny business on the phone starts. The first phone conversations on Friday are okay, because he shows up, doesn't have passport pictures, so Duran sends him away, comes back with that, and she says, well, you can't get a transit visa from us unless you have your visa from the Soviets first. So she sends him over to the Soviet embassy, goes there, and they say, no, we can't. You got to get it from Washington. And he's like, yeah, okay, well, we'll get the papers for you, but it takes several months. And so he's really angry. He walks back and talks to Duran. His third trip on Friday, he says, oh, they gave me their permission. It's all in the bag. And she picks up the phone and busts him, talks to Kostakov. This is a real conversation. This is not, nobody's impersonating anything here. They talk to each other every day. And so, she hangs up and says no, and then he gets very almost physical, has to be ejected from the consulate. Well, after that, all those phone conversations are Hollywood DreamWorks. Everything's closed on Saturday, and here's a really weird phone call from the Cuban consulate, the Soviet embassy, on Saturday, discussing this, and there's nobody at the Cuban consulate. We know that. Actually, there are people at the Soviet consulate, but they're not there in their ties and jackets. They're in volleyball uniform. They play volleyball with East European bloc countries every Saturday morning, okay? And there's no phone call. There's no phone call. And so what there is Oswald shows up. There's no phone call. Oswald just shows up. He talks to him. It's the same story. He puts a gun on the table and cries, "This is what I have to do to protect myself from the FBI." And they say again, "Would you like us to fill out the papers, and send them to Washington?" Anyway, the phone conversation that allegedly took place, makes no sense. It tells me only one thing, that who's ever impersonating him or taking instructions from somebody to do the impersonation has only observed Oswald going in and out of the buildings, but does not know what is taking place inside of them. Because we know what took place inside them. We have everybody's books. We have all the documents and the interviews that were done with them by the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee. And so you can reconstruct what happened inside and look at that next to the actual text of the transcripts and understand that they don't work. So that's how you know that they're making this story up on the fly. Anyway, what they do, which is important in the Soviet embassy, instead of playing volleyball, is sit down and write up a huge report and send it to KGB Central, which later on, after Kennedy dies, is what saves their ears. If they hadn't done that, they'd have got deep trouble. But they put the monkey on KGB Central's back by sending that summary of events back there in the day. But, what's happening here, look, I basically put that together, what I just told you, before I ever saw the Lopez report. It hadn't been released yet. And I did it on the strength of what I just told you. I read all the reports and all the books and everything, and I understood that the person on the phone didn't know what the hell was going on inside those buildings. It contradicted what the Oswald character, whether it's him or an imposter, actually went through and said it did. And that's why I know that's so stupid on the Tuesday call, right? The Oswald guy calls in, mentions Kostakov by name, of course, to get that in the record. And then the Oswald character asks if there's any, response from Washington on the request, which was never sent. But the impersonator didn't know that. Okay, so what's really going on here is setting up the files, setting up Oswald's legend, and setting up the files. And you have anachronisms, by the way, on the Cuban trip. I've got several. I got a good file. It's the Pedro Charles letters. You ever heard of those? Lee, it was great to see you in Cuba. He got 3 letters, talking about like he was there. That was all that's done before the fact. And one of these guys that probably Phillips motivated, and I'm not talking about Guillermo Ruiz here. That's another thing. It's in the Vesiana story. I'm in the middle of that right now in Volume 3. Oh my gosh, what a story that is. But anyway, there's the AM-COG group that was involved in the assassination plots against Castro, and I think I did this in Volume 1, I think. Yeah, I did that in Volume 1. And so AM-COG 5 says he saw Castro walking around with a cigar in short-sleeved shirts in Havana about this time. So you have these anachronisms that were originally created to make it look like Oswald was there, and all they do now is tell us what this pre-existing plot to kill the president was, what was involved in it, what the story was. And the Guillermo Ruiz thing is similar. It's allegedly Phillips wants Vesiana's, the husband of his cousin, Guillermo Ruiz, who was in Cuban intelligence, to say that he saw Oswald in Cuba. And then Phillips says when he finds out that nothing's been heard yet, he says, drop it. Because you don't want to do anything done after that point to make it look like Oswald went to Cuba is going to get you in trouble. It's just going to expose that you're part of an operation. And you remember J. Edgar Hoover's letter from Morris Childs, his Operation Solo guy, the penetration, the Childs brothers, that was so super secret, Hoover would never tell anybody who it was anyway. He says that, the Cubans told him, he went down there and kept saying, oh yeah, Oswald threatened to kill the president and all that. So that was Hoover's contribution in May or so, April or May of '64, to this whole business of Oswald going to Cuba, which I don't put any stock in whatsoever. That was the original plan as far as I'm concerned, and it didn't work. And so it was replaced, with these phone calls linking Oswald to the Cubans and to Kostakov, who's the head of KGB assassinations for the Western Hemisphere Division. So the story doesn't stop. The story goes to what happens when Scott has to tell headquarters about this, what happened. And he does. And he does it matter-of-factly. He talks about the photograph of the guy. He doesn't say it's Oswald, but just, this is the guy we photographed going in around the time of the phone call. That's all it says. And, they ask for traces on, like, who's this guy? You guys got anything up there at headquarters on it? And so that's when John Whitten is given the task of sitting down and writing the reply. He's head of the Mexico desk in WH3. And so he opens the 201 file to see what they know about Oswald. And there's nothing in there since May of '62. Oswald's still in the Soviet Union as far as the CIA knows. And so that's what he puts in his reply. He hasn't got a clue who Kostakov is or why that's radioactive because he's not involved in counterintelligence. So they put here's the guy answering when Scott's memo, who has absolutely no clue what any of this means. And then he finds out, and he gets really angry. And he starts doing Cuban stuff, right? And that's when Angleton fires him. So where was all this stuff? Well, it's kind of similar to the story about Oswald files, after the defection. They didn't go where they were supposed to. Well, all this stuff. The FBI story on the Dallas placard and Viva Fidel and the whole story in New Orleans was missing. It was put into a separate place over the summer, so it wouldn't show up in the 201 file. And, of course, Jefferson Morley, if you talked to him, he and I went together. I actually did the questioning of Jane Roman and showed her all the routing slips that she signed off on that, showed that she read all that stuff that didn't exist. Well, anyway, that's an important part of the story, what happened afterwards, because you have, what it exposed was the exchange of cables and then all those routing slips exposed the fact that you have the CIA making up lies about Oswald, not just after the assassination, but 6 weeks before it.
And this inevitably leads to Oswald's role as the fall guy, or the patsy, on November 22nd, 1963. Now, I asked this question to all my JFK guests, so tonight I'm going to ask you. What role, if any, do you think Oswald played in the assassination of JFK? Now, there are three possible answers. 1, Oswald was the lone nut, as described by the Warren Commission. 2, Oswald was either wittingly or unwittingly involved in the assassination plot, if not the murder itself. Or 3, Oswald was not involved at all.
Well, I'll do the last one. Yeah, he's involved in the conspiracy. The question is, how much does he know about it? And I don't think much until he ends up in the Dallas police building, after Kennedy's dead. Then he gets it. As far as the first question, was he involved in the shooting of JFK? My answer is a maybe. But it's not a good maybe. It's pretty shaky when you go through. And I'm really not a Dealey Plaza person because there's always 5,000 guys at the water cooler around that. I think the crime scene extends into the National Archives, and that's where I'm hanging out. But anyway, from what I know, what I've read over the years, he had to run downstairs real fast and get a Coke and do all this stuff, and so the timing isn't so good. But he was a bad shot. He wasn't very good anyway. You've got a moving target 225 feet going away to the left through the leaves of the trees, and you got a Mannlicher Carcano, the peace weapon in World War II, that you got to, pull the bolt back every time. And I know the story, I know all that stuff. But if he is up there shooting, he missed. Now that's my take on that. But I don't write about ballistics and forensics because we've got, like I said, I got a lot of friends that are doing that. I'm happy to do that if I'm the only person at an event where there's a lot of new people. I do the single bullet theory because that'll make them listen to me for the rest of the presentation. But if I go to one of these JFK events, I don't hang out. I'm not on those panels.
And speaking of the JFK world, who do you read and who do you respect?
Peter Dale Scott's always been a mentor of mine forever, basically. I mean, Peter Scott actually wrote a chapter in the Senator Gravel edition, not the New York Times Pentagon Papers. The 5-volume Senator Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers. And Scott was the one. He didn't have any of the documents we talked about tonight. these NSINs, and he guessed that there had been a policy reversal between JFK and Johnson way back then. And I remember calling Peter up, when I was putting together the book, the final time I was working on the movie with Stoney, and I called Peter Stout up and I said, "You don't know me. My name is Major John Newman." I said, but I'm resurrecting you. He hadn't said anything in years and years. And I hope that's okay with you because it's going to be a ride. But like I said, I pretty much avoided getting personally involved in bullets and ballistics and that sort of thing. But the researchers I'm working closest with now, Dan Hardway, Bill Simpich, Malcolm Blunt, and some others. I do read everybody, not so much on Dealey Plaza events, but those are the people that I have a little bell that rings that if there's something for me, I go straight to it because I'm very busy. But I eventually get to just about everything. I have to. I'm a curmudgeon going across the beach, and I'm turning over every grain of sand.
I think you almost have to. Now, we recently lost Jim Mars, and I would just like to know your thoughts. Were you able to meet Jim Mars? Did you know Jim Mars?
Yes, we met, but not, and we did have a casual conversation, but very short, only because we showed up at the same JFK events and that sort of thing. So I knew him, I liked him, and I'm sorry that he's passed.
Yes, it's absolutely a sad loss. Now, we've recently had some JFK documents released, and quite a bit earlier than a lot of people were expecting.
Including the intelligence community, I'll bet.
Absolutely. Now, how have they changed your research, and what do you think about the new documents?
Yeah, well, they haven't changed my research at all. Now, I've heard some people, I think in Politico and in some of the other forums that I do have respect for, a lot of the people. I should have mentioned Jerry Shinley. He's a guy, I haven't seen a book by him, but he's a hell of a researcher that I came to know. I made a mistake in Volume 1 that he helped straighten me out on, and I fixed that. But look, in this new release, we had tons of new cryptonyms uncovered and pseudonyms and country digraphs, and I live and trade in that stuff. And other than one error for Merton, Phyllis instead of Jack Stewart, which I corrected in the second edition of Volume 1 before the new release, I was actually concerned. I made probably in both of those volumes upwards of 400 predictions on cryptonyms and pseudonyms that hadn't been broken. And right now I'm batting 1,000%, so I'm no longer concerned about that. And but I'm working with great people now too, like Bill Simpich, and there's several others that are in on this project. We've done on Mary Farrell, and we're going to continue to do it. The pseudonym list is available on the AARC website, and we're continuing to work on that. Every volume I do, I put the new crypts and pseudos that we're able to uncover. And so this new release was I was like a kid in a candy store as far as that stuff goes. But a lot of the things that I had written about, especially in Volume 2, the stay-behind nets. Emilio Rodriguez, that I uncovered who he was, all his cryptid pseudos, and also his cohort in crime, Tony Sforza, and a third guy. All that has been verified. All those identifications I made in this new release, so I'm happy about that. And the same thing with my work on Lumumba and the QJ Win stuff in the Congo. Besides a lot of new stuff on Emilio Rodriguez, there's good new stuff on Guillermo Ruiz that's in there. There's even some stuff I saw on the Martin and Mitchell case, which I continue to watch. There was some stuff on Cobb. There was stuff on Gibson, the FPCC guy, the AM World Project. So we're getting a lot of stuff, that's documents that have redactions that now don't. And that's just brain power you don't have to waste anymore, You just go back. So what I've had to do with this stuff, there's so much of it, is that in my digital directories, and then I have subdirectories and more subdirectories, in each one of them, there's now a new folder. It says 2017. So rather than mix the stuff up for right now with the other stuff, it's just everything that's a newly declassified or a now unredacted document that was previously released is filed in the place where it should be, only it's in a subfolder called 2017, so I can keep track of what's happening here. And so I like it. I'm concerned about a lot of things. I think that there's a lot of documents that that I copied 26 years ago with my good friend Jay Hardy that are gone. And for the first time, I saw correspondence between Rex Bradford and NARA on how many docs and all this type of stuff. And there was an admission on their side that they discovered some things that were fully released before are no longer apparently in existence. And I found stuff worse than that. I found stuff that the riff sheet is all empty. All the fields are empty. And I have the riff sheets where they're all filled out. But I copied it 26 years ago. So somebody's walked out of NARA with stuff under their shirts. You know, there's a lot of that been going on, and it's not about unimportant stuff. It's about important stuff. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. I think that has to be a whole new thing. Right now, I'm not going to say anything to criticize NARA. I think they're very, very busy, and I think they're doing a good job. But it's a hard one. But I think at some point we have to start addressing some of these other categories where we need the stuff, and they got to go back to the agency and back to the Senate to get the church committee stuff that's missing. There must be copies over there, or at least we have to check. So there's a lot of cleanup that has to happen behind this release right now. All I want is for it to continue. For one big reason, by the way, one big reason. You know, it doesn't matter. No, it does matter who killed Kennedy and why, but it matters less than that today there is not a government agency that is withholding information on the case. That means a lot to the American people who own these documents. And yes, if there are a couple of things here or there that might cause somebody's death, but now it's almost impossible because everybody's dead. They should be withheld. Basically, we need everything out on the table for the health of our republic.
And I couldn't agree more. Dr. John Newman, if anyone wants to find out more about what you're writing or what you've written, where can they go?
I've got a website. That's jfkjmn.com.
That's jfkjmn.com. This is Dr. John Newman. Dr. Newman, thank you very much for being on the show. I hope you come back.
I look forward to it. Thank you very much for having me.
He is Dr. John Newman. I'm S.D. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. What did the CIA know about Lee Harvey Oswald, and why did they keep it secret for decades? Who was James Jesus Angleton, and how did his hunt for a mole within the agency change the hunt for JFK's real killers?
Hi, this is Jefferson Morley, author of CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files, and the upcoming book, The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master James Jesus Angleton. If you want to know what was contained within the CIA's files and Lee Harvey Oswald, as well as the role James Angleton played in the Kennedy-era CIA, listen to episode 14 of Midnight Rider News Show and visit jfkfacts.org today.
Dr. John Newman said something very interesting toward the end of the interview tonight. He said that he reads almost everyone because he believes something can be turned up in doing so. This is something in which I also believe. The JFK community is very fractured, and it may always be. Until I became intimately involved with those in it, I never knew that there were so many factions as there are, and it's sad, really. I own books from all the factions, and I probably always will. To me, if I can gain something from a few pages of someone's work, if not the entirety of their work, then I appreciate what they've done. Even if I don't buy their premise, it can and does open my mind to possibilities which I may have previously closed out of my own theories, and I think that's good. Everyone in an alternative historical community claims they're open-minded. No one claims they're a conspiracist, and everyone claims they only deal in facts. Yet, we still come to different conclusions. I believe that's healthy as opposed to unhealthy, and I believe it's, at the very least, interesting as opposed to buying the rote textbook answers of a McGraw-Hill, for example. We have representatives from all sides, all factions, and all theories on this show, and they will always be treated with the respect I believe they deserve. I've learned something in all 23 episodes, and I hope that you have too. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to S.T. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.